The February 8th, 2019 Governance and Policy Committee of the Board of Regents of the University of Minnesota will now come to order. Welcome everyone, glad to see everyone made it in. We'll start with the first agenda item, which is the Board of Regents policy appointments to organizations and boards. This item is for review, and I will turn it over to Executive Director and Corporate Secretary Brian Steeves.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, this is an off-cycle amendment to Board of Regents policy amendments to organizations and boards, and it's driven by the joint clinical enterprise agreement between the University of Minnesota Physicians and Fairview Health Services. What the amendments do are three things. First, it strikes the Board of Governors, University of Minnesota Health, as an entity to which you make appointments, because that board went away as part of the joint clinical enterprise. Second, it inserts a new board of directors for the University of Minnesota Health Clinics and Surgery Center. That board will oversee just that, the Clinics and Surgery Center facility, and you'll be making appointments to that as outlined in the policy, in the amendments. And then third, it removes the requirement for a special selection committee to be formed to review recommended nominations for the mHealth Board of Governors and the Fairview Health Services Board. Instead, going forward, Fairview Health Services Board appointments would come to the full board for consideration. So the president would make recommendations to the full board for consideration. And so those are the changes that are outlined in this. In many ways, it's a technical change in the sense that you've taken other actions that necessitate some of these actions, but then there's also just some other cleanup that's outlined in here. So it's up for review this cycle, but since this committee does not meet until June, it's possible that you may want to go ahead and adopt the changes today if there's not questions or concerns about them.
Thank you, Mr. Steeves. So this is, the item is up for review, as Mr. Steeves has stated. We can proceed with a conversation on the review, or if based on Mr. Steeves' presentation, the intent of the committee would be to move it forward under our standard of motion, second, and no objections. We would certainly take that. The chair would entertain a motion of that variety as well. If there is no motion, I'll just open the floor for conversation.
I'll move for action.
There's a motion to proceed with action on this item this month. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Are there any objections to moving it to an action item this month? Hearing no objections, we'll go ahead with the discussion and move to a vote. Is there any discussion with respect to the proposed changes before you in your docket? Regent Anderson.
The only change I'm asking Mr. Steeves is to the subdivision to the University of Minnesota Health Clinics and Surgery Center, and if that is the case, was that prompted by anything with mHealth? I mean, was there a new agreement with Fairview?
Director Steeves.
Mr. Chair, Regent Anderson, yes, my understanding is that this construct was contemplated in that joint clinical enterprise that we adopted, or that this board adopted with University of Minnesota Physicians and Fairview Health Services.
Regent Anderson?
Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to get to the bottom of why we are changing it, but that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions or comments from members of the committee? Hearing none, we'll proceed to a vote. All those in favor of the proposed changes signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Mr. Steeves. All right, we'll move to the second item on this morning's agenda, higher education strategic planning. And we are very pleased to have Dr. Sally Mason with AGB Consulting joining us today to facilitate. Before we proceed, I'm taking a little prerogative. I thought this was kind of interesting and sort of sets us up for the conversation about strategic planning and the importance of this role. A friend of mine, Scott Graham, had mailed to me a while back a copy of the annual report of the Board of Regents of the University of Minnesota to the Governor of Minnesota, dated November 30th, 1873. And the reason Mr. Graham sent this is his great-great-grandfather is named Calvin Tuttle. And there's a Tuttle Elementary, I think, not too far from here, if I'm not mistaken. But it's a name that doesn't necessarily come to mind, even for folks that have spent a lot of time around the university. But just reading a little piece out of the report, it said that 22 years ago, this is in 1870s now, last February, since the legislature passed the charter of the university and that then strife came for the location of the public buildings. St. Anthony was satisfied to get the university. There was great difficulty experienced in finding a site, and after several had been proposed and rejected, the present one was decided on. That was not obtained without trouble. Colonel George obtained part of the land from Mr. Cheever, and it was not until Calvin A. Tuttle, Mr. Graham's great-great-grandfather, came forward and donated 9 acres adjoining that the grounds were secured. And it's a wonderful read. There's a map here, and you might recognize the actual location of the Tuttle land. It's where we're sitting right now. So people many, many years before us were so critical in establishing the university, and the documents go on to talk about a political battle hoping to move the university out of the city, something to the south. I think we've heard some of those stories before, and that Mr. Tuttle and others were committed to the present location, and their strategic vision for where the university would be located is an indelible part of what the University of Minnesota is today. So here we are a century and a half later, moving into conversations about where this great institution is going to go for the next 150 or more years. Regent Omari.
Yeah, thank you, Regent Rocha, for the history. So do you know anything beyond that? I mean, because this is indigenous land, so do you know if the Tuttle family somehow?
You would presume that there was a homesteading type presentation, but that would actually be fascinating. I don't know if and that very well may be in the volumes of history of this area and the university, but that might be, we can talk about maybe trying to track that down, because I certainly be very interested to know what the history of the land was prior to Mr. Tuttle coming into it, and there's a bit of a history of his having quite a bit of success in acquiring land in this area, and there are other public institutions that benefited from Mr. Tuttle's contributions. All right, and so with that, I will turn it over to Director Steeves to set up this conversation, and welcome Dr. Mason. We're very excited to have you here.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, you may recall that when you did comprehensive changes to board operations and agenda guidelines, you established that a system-wide strategic plan was one of the fundamental planning documents of the university, along with an operating budget and a capital budget. So you've in policy established that this is an important priority for the board to engage in and to work collaboratively with the administration in developing. At this point in time, as you know, an effort was begun to create a system-wide strategic plan, but it was put on pause as the presidential search process proceeded. And so it's anticipated that that will be something that's on the horizon both for President-designate Gable and for this board. So today's conversation is not specific to the University of Minnesota's system-wide strategic plan, but what it's intended to do is to lay some of the foundation, to give you background in different approaches to strategic plans in higher education, to give you some context and some opportunity to discuss the role of the board and the role of the administration and how those can work together to successfully plan and execute against that plan. So, and Dr. Mason, with her experience both as a Big Ten president and in working with a number of higher ed institutions across the country, is uniquely qualified to be able to lead us in this conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Steeves, and again, very happy to have you here, and I will turn the floor over to you.
It's great to be here again. It's nice to be here. I wish I could have come when it wasn't quite so cold and snowy. But nevertheless, here we are, and after 4 hours in the Atlanta airport yesterday, it was great to get to Minneapolis, I have to tell you that. The purpose today is to really get you engaged in a conversation, and I'm going to use some very personal examples from the Big Ten and from at least another research university research-intensive university out there to hopefully get you thinking about how this process can and has worked at other institutions. I'm not going to talk about strategic plans that haven't fared well at a variety of institutions, but using the 4 examples that I'm going to give you today, I think you're going to see a variety of ways in which boards and presidents approach the strategic planning process. One of the basic tenets of AGB in helping boards become the best that they can be is to outline best practices. And there is no doubt that tasking a president with creating a strategic plan is a fundamental and very, very basic role for a board, a governing board. So very simple. These are the relevant publications that AGB has out there. For those of you who want to read a little bit more about strategic thinking and planning in higher ed, I recommend the first one up here, Larry Shin's book. It's not a big book, but it does give a lot of great examples across a variety of institutions. And it does show and tell how governing institutions typically approach strategic planning processes. And there's a variety of ways you can do that. The other 2 publications I think are valuable, but probably less so in terms of the specifics of strategic planning. So if you were going to spend some time looking at one, I'd recommend that first one. Now, the examples I'm going to give you are, 2 of them are from the same, but another Big Ten university, and I do this both as an alum of Purdue, but also as the former provost at Purdue University before I became president at Iowa. The other Big Ten example I'll give you was at Iowa, because I think it's one that perhaps bears some relevance in terms of how you will think about the system as a whole, and we'll get to that. The story, I really am going to do this in a storytelling mode. So stop me anywhere along the way to ask questions if you have them. I'm going to probably go at this from a couple of different viewpoints. But I promise you they will come together in the end, and hopefully you'll see how boards and campuses converge in the strategic planning process. So let me talk first about Purdue University for the years that I was there, 2001 through 2007. In 2000, Purdue University, after 17 years of President Steve Beering being at the helm of Purdue University, a new president arrived, Martin Jischke. Now, he was far from new as a president. This was Martin's 4th presidency. So he was very seasoned. He had been at another AAU university. He'd been president for 11 years at Iowa State University. Before that, he'd been at what today is the Missouri University of Science and Technology, the old mining and technology university in Rolla, Missouri. And before that, he'd been interim president at the University of Oklahoma. He once told me that from a very young age, he knew he wanted to be a university president. He's an MIT-trained engineer, very process-oriented, very analytical in his thinking, had a tendency sometimes, because he was so smart, to often intimidate people, and not necessarily knowing that he was doing that, but he was just someone who was so focused and so directed in the work that he was doing that he could sometimes just run right over people without even recognizing that he was doing it. Steve Beering was quite a different kind of president for Purdue. Purdue, you may know, does not have a medical school, and yet Steve Beering was a medical doctor. That was his training. He was an unusual, after a failed presidential search, he was an unusual choice for the board to make, and he remained president for 17 years at Purdue. Now, during that 17 years, Steve did some wonderful things on the campus. Purdue never had a strategic plan. That was not their culture. That was not something that Steve Beering was particularly interested in. And so it was not something that either the board or the president were particularly talking about at the time. As Steve approached the magic age in Indiana of 65, which at the time was the mandatory age for retirement for senior executives, there is still a law in the books in Indiana that says that at 65, executives will retire from their executive positions. So as Steve approached 65, the board began to have conversations with him about transition and about a new president. Steve was very reluctant. He was very comfortable in the president's position. Things were going well for him. His first 3 years on the job were tumultuous. He came very, very close to a vote of no confidence. And if you know anything about Purdue University, you know that engineers pretty much let things go. They're not going to interfere with the operations or running of the university. I know you have an engineer. Eric, just sit and be quiet, okay? But at any rate, they tend not to make waves. But Steve was this close to getting a vote of no confidence. And at the time, he had a very influential dean of liberal arts on that campus, a fellow by the name of Bob Ringel. Bob single-handedly kept that from happening and then used it as a vehicle to become provost and help Steve for the remaining 13 years of his 17-year term as president. So the two had been in position for a long, long time in running things, and it was very comfortable. Too comfortable for the taste of most of the trustees by the year 2000. By the year 2000, the trustees had transitioned to the point where, now at Purdue, trustees are selected in a very different way. The majority, I believe it's six of the 9 trustees are selected by the governor. 3 are elected by the Alumni Association. At the time, in the year 2000, all of the trustees at Purdue were Purdue alums, and most of them were engineers. And there was growing concern among the engineers on the board that Purdue was losing its stature as an engineering school. It had slipped in the rankings. And they had one goal in mind in selecting a new president, and that was getting someone who would restore the glitter to Purdue as an engineering mecca. Bring the programs overall back up into the top 5 in the nation. They had slipped down, they were still in the top 15 for the most part, but they had slipped quite a bit during that time. So that was the goal of the trustees. That was what the board wanted. The board simply wanted someone who was going to really reinvigorate the campus. So when Martin Jischke was hired, the campus was very excited because for the first time now in almost 20 years, they had new leadership and they had an engineer at the helm. So suddenly this set the scene for a very different set of opportunities, let's put it that way. Martin knew right away that he was going to start a strategic planning process. In fact, not only did he know he was going to start a strategic planning process, he knew what that strategic plan was going to look like. And he had a financial plan in mind for how to fund it. Those two things are, I think, very, very important. It's one thing to have a strategic plan and to talk about goals and aspirations, to have measurements and metrics whereby you can assess how well your institution is doing. But it's another thing entirely to have a vehicle for funding some of the initiatives that are going to drive those aspirations to reality. And Martin was a master at knowing how to do these things. Of course, he'd done it at 3 other institutions. So he was no slackard when it came to strategic planning. He also had a very, very good person in his office when he was president at Iowa State, an architect. And quite literally, he was the architect of the strategic plans that Martin had at Iowa State, and he became the architect because he followed Martin to Purdue. He became the architect for the plan at Purdue. Now, this is what I call a top-down, bottom-up approach. Martin knew very well what he wanted. He also had learned from his experiences, particularly at Iowa State, that if you don't bring the faculty along with you, your chances of succeeding in all of the efforts that you want to have in your strategic plan, it's going to be tough. And bringing a large campus along with you in the strategic planning process can be challenging, to say the least. On many campuses, and this was true on the Purdue campus, the provost becomes the leader of the strategic planning process for the campus. So when I came into the provost position almost a year into Martin's tenure as president. The first thing he did was hire a new provost. Starting to sound familiar? I knew what my responsibilities were going to be, and one of them was going to be to take this vision, and Martin laid it out for me nicely on a piece of paper. He showed me exactly what he wanted in his strategic plan, and he showed me exactly how he planned to finance it. So it was a matter now of going out to the campus and beginning to energize the campus along the lines of what we knew the president wanted to have. He also had the complete and total trust of the board. Here was a board that had, in fact, they had tried on multiple occasions to recruit him to come to Purdue. They finally got him to accede to come to Purdue. They caught him on a day when, this is very interesting, and I know this from the inside out. They caught him on a day when the governor in Iowa at the time had reneged on a promise that he'd made to Purdue. And Martin was extremely upset. He'd felt betrayed. The chairman of the board, Tim McGinley, called Martin that day on the phone, just accidentally, serendipitously. And Martin said, yes, I'll come and interview. And they were literally down to the 11th hour on the search. He interviewed. He was the unanimous choice very quickly for presidency, became president, and he and the board for the 8 years that he was president were absolutely in sync all the way along. Turns out that he and Tim McGinley, the chair of the board, had been Washington Fellows together many years ago. So they had shared a common experience. They became very, to this day, they still are very, very close friends, as well as good working colleagues. So it was wonderful chemistry between the president and the board of trustees. So the plan, the strategic plan was well underway. The process was well underway when I joined the campus, and it was really my job to go out and college by college, open forum by open forum, conversation after conversation, really listen hard to what the faculty were saying about what they wanted to see in a strategic plan, and at the same time interject elements of what I knew the president wanted to see in a strategic plan. So what did we get in the end? What we got in the end was actually quite simple. There would be lots of opportunities for investment, because here's what Martin had done. And these days, investment opportunities are a little trickier, but there's still some things here that I think are very relevant as you think about strategic planning going forward. First and foremost, Martin was raising money like crazy. He was very, very good at it. He had gotten every trustee on the board to be a major, significant donor, several of them donating enough money to begin buildings in a research park that we were going to construct called Discovery Park. And this would be separate from the research park at Purdue, which was out of town and is an incubator and a magnet for businesses coming to West Lafayette. This would actually be on the Purdue campus. This would be a very different kind of opportunity. It would be a series of research buildings that would be interdisciplinary in nature. They wouldn't belong to any one engineering department or science department or any other department for that matter. They would be run by center directors. They would be operating by attracting new faculty positions in a very different way than Purdue had ever done it before. And my job as provost was to sort of coordinate this dance. And I knew it was going to be tricky, but I had the opportunity, because of the way in which aging had been occurring at Purdue, I had the opportunity over my first 2 years to hire 12 deans, which was almost total turnover. The only dean that I didn't hire the entire time that I was at Purdue was the business dean. And he was very good, and I was actually glad that I didn't have to do that one. And he was very, very collaborative. What I could promise as provost was the possibility of 500 new faculty lines. Now, yeah, your jaw drops. So how do you fund 500 new faculty lines? Because that was my first question. I said, I can't go out and promise this to people if we can't deliver on this. And the way it was done, Purdue hadn't seen a tuition increase in, more than a decade. And it was almost at the bottom of the Big Ten when it came to tuition, and yet offering all these very expensive engineering programs. So Martin had already gotten the board on board with a tuition increase. Now, that's probably not realistic today, although looking at your tuition is always a good thing to do, and making certain that it's aligned in ways that are useful and good, I think, is absolutely necessary. And understanding how the budget operates. Now, the other thing that Purdue had was long-term and long-time CFOs. So the business people at Purdue, and if you know any long-time successful CFOs, you might know that they're really, really good at hiding money, especially from the president. Okay. Now, one of the
Do we have a rebuttal from the gallery?
Yeah, anyone want to speak up on this side?
Brian and I will keep our own counsel.
Okay, all right. My husband says the biggest problem with me in retirement is that I have no more filters, so you're going to get the unadulterated truth
That's right.
on these subjects today. So there was a lot, and Martin was a master at understanding budget. He'd actually gone back to school and taken business classes so he could understand finance and budget. And he knew, within a year, he knew where there was a lot of money that had been sort of tucked away. CFOs always feel good if they've got money for a rainy day, or if they've got reserves, or they've got a way to manage a budget that gives some flexibility when they need it. And Steve Beering was not one to push on this issue at all. As long as he could do the kinds of things that he was interested in doing for the campus, he was quite happy as president. Martin, however, wanted to really push the envelope on this. And within a year, the long-serving, long-time CFO decided to retire because he could no longer take the stress of Martin constantly poking around in the budget. And his number two person, also a very, very good person, took over. And Martin had a plan to not only use existing resources, to reallocate. I mean, reallocation, creating efficiencies, and I knew coming in as provost that one of the things that we would do right off the bat was look hard at our administrative structure and create efficiencies wherever we could to free up resources. So we had new tuition, we had reallocation, we had fundraising, and the fundraising was in large part helpful for two reasons. One, in helping us build the buildings in Discovery Park that would house many of the new faculty that we would hire. And we had the luxury of a Lilly Endowment in the state of Indiana. Some of you may be familiar with the Lilly Endowment, but they do give money outside of Indiana, but mostly to religious schools. Otherwise, most of the money is for Indiana University and Purdue University. Martin had talked them into $25 million, which he handed me on my first day on the job and said, these are going to be to help cover startup costs for those new faculty that you're going to hire. So I knew I had that in my back pocket too. Plus the usual kinds of resources that come along with attrition, with retirements and things like that. So we really had the perfect storm for creating a strategic plan that could be successful. It energized the campus in ways that even we didn't anticipate. In fact, today I still look at Purdue and see some of the fruits that are coming to bear because of Martin's vision and my having the really good fortune of being able to be by his side as we change things significantly. The other thing that hiring new faculty, now 500 new lines, in addition to almost that many retirements that we knew would come up during the course of the 8 years that Martin was president, because I sat down and did all the calculations for looking at the demographics of the age and so forth and so on. So we knew we had a real opportunity here not only to increase the numbers, but diversify the faculty significantly. And by the time we finished and we had filled most of those positions, the new faculty looked very, very different from the old faculty. There were many more women, there were many more people of color, there were many more interesting hires than Purdue had had in many, many years. So it was a, you know, it really was an amazing time. Of course, it was all pre-recession too. Basic elements of the plan were to maintain excellence in undergraduate programs, improve retention and graduation, reduce time to graduation, all the things that, of course, you have to report on nationally. You'll see those in every strategic plan. It doesn't matter how visionary and how bold a strategic plan, they have to be there. I mean, they have to be the kinds of things that you're thinking about. But for Purdue, in this particular case, it was really grow the research enterprise. Martin was frustrated because without a medical school, many presidents just automatically think, well, we can't grow the research enterprise without being able to tap into NIH. Well, there are ways that you can do that. Certainly creating the research opportunities, the interdisciplinary engineering opportunities that we did, especially on the Purdue campus, greatly enhanced their research capacity and the numbers. The numbers of active researchers coming to West Lafayette also helped. We forced, in a nice way, interdisciplinarity. That's not a natural thing in a heavily siloed institution. You're probably familiar with that. You've got departments and colleges. Deans get very protective. They especially get protective depending on what your budget model is. If you've got Martin was never a fan of what's known as RCM, or Responsibility Centered Management in higher education, because it would frequently pit colleges against each other, because you were basically having to generate a lot of your own resources. And the way you did that was by attracting students. So if you had an RCM model, in some cases, engineering suddenly wanted to teach all their own math courses, which was duplication and made no sense. So we were very careful about those kinds of things. We were very careful about duplicating. And what I was able to do is create cluster hires and cluster hire themes on campus where deans knew they had to come with me. More than one dean had to come with a plan if they wanted to hire into a cluster. And when they did that, if and when they did that, the plans would get approved, they would get new lines, and I can tell you the fastest way to keep faculty out of mischief is to keep them busy hiring. They after 5 years or so of that, they were begging to, could we not do this for a year so we can take a big deep breath and see where we are. And we were doing things like that, not unusual. We did build Discovery Park. If you've ever been to the Purdue campus, it's quite a phenomenon. There's an interdisciplinary nanotechnology research facility on that campus. There is an entrepreneurship center. There's it's a bioscience center, but it's largely focused on a particular area of the biosciences where Purdue had real strength. There were and a lot of collaboration across different fields because of that, and it actually worked very, very well. I mentioned the finances, the looking for efficiencies and reallocations, tuition, fundraising, and then, of course, if you're successful in terms of hiring, federal funding goes up, and it did. Federal funding doubled during the time that I was there and during the time that Martin was president. It has plateaued just a bit in recent years, and I think largely because of the recession and other conditions that have led to things that are much harder to get your hands around. So why it worked? Well, the president and the board were completely in sync. By the way, Purdue is a system. People sometimes forget that. There are 4 campuses. There's one, well, actually 2 of them have been merged now. This is, again, the result of the North Central and Calumet campuses have been turned into one. The Fort Wayne campus still exists independently. And then there's the curious IUPUI in Indianapolis that everyone wonders, well, okay, what is that thing? Well, it was, I was actually in Bloomington as a postdoc when they moved the medical school to Indianapolis, which made a lot of sense. But it really hurt the Bloomington campus in a major way. Initially, sending the medical school to Indianapolis was a way that the Bloomington campus looked at to kind of banish less productive faculty members. And they sent them up there, but the medical school is a driver all unto itself and became a force unto itself. They wanted engineers too. And the only way the state of Indiana would let them have engineers would be to do it through Purdue. So you have Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis, or UIPUI, IUPUI. The strategic planning processes had to be, on each campus, had to be coincident with the West Lafayette campuses, and the provost on each of those campuses led the process. Lots of listening went into this process, lots of bringing faculty along. I think if you asked faculty who were there during that time, they would tell you that it was a faculty-driven effort. I can tell you that it was largely led from the top, from the board and the president on down, but we converged in the middle in a very, very comfortable place, and it led to very, very good results. Any questions? Any thoughts? Any comments at this point?
Yeah, Doctor, I just want to be mindful that Regent Beeson and I are only trusted with an hour and 15 minutes for our meetings, which is probably smart. So we need to be mindful. I want to make sure that we have a chance to ask questions and that there is some engagement. Regent Hsu and then Regent Powell.
Thank you, Regent Rocha. Wonderful story. I'm just wondering how much public funding did Purdue get at that time, if you recall?
Oh, what the level of state funding was? It was not extraordinary. I mean, it was about typical for a research university. I don't remember the actual dollar figures at that time, but it was, it was maybe of the academic budget, it was maybe 30%, that level. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Powell.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair Sally. Thank you.
Yeah.
You made the comment that, hey, look, there are certain things that just have to be done as part of the strategic plan. I'll speak for myself. I resonated with that, and then so the Purdue committed themselves to that.
Yes.
But then said, I think what I heard you say is we're gonna focus on growing the research enterprise.
Yeah.
That's really the critical.
That one big goal.
One big thing.
Big thing.
So would you maybe go down and hired lots of faculty, maybe go down one level, presumably within that, I mean, it wasn't go out and, hire willy-nilly. I mean, it's going to be aeronautics.
Had to be planned,
but
yeah.
Talk a bit about how many focus areas they chose and maybe what they were, but just some sense of how they actually made that happen.
Yeah.
Dr. Mason, and if I can just add that, and maybe explain about how they chose.
Sure.
If that, Regent Powell, if I'm not.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Dr. Mason.
Martin spent some time speaking particularly with the engineering faculty and what was, quote, hot at that time. So nanotechnology was hot. They had a trustee by the name of Mike Burke on the board at that time. Mike was Tell Labs. If you've been up to Chicago, you've probably seen Tell Labs. That was Mike's company. Mike immediately put $35 million on the table to build the nanotechnology facility in Discovery Park, and Martin basically told me, and the only faculty we're putting in there are interdisciplinary faculty, so they're going to have to be hired. We had a couple of senior distinguished faculty members whose area that was, and they kind of led the charge in terms of helping us with the recruiting, and it was always a multiple department or college effort when we went out to hire the faculty. I brought the deans had been used to sort of being on their own, and they weren't used to working together as a team. So having the opportunity to hire new deans and bring them in with the idea that we're a big team now, and we're going to do this together, and this is going to be fun. I would tell you that of those 12 deans, 6 of them are sitting presidents today. They did very well. I was fortunate. I was able to hire mostly well. I've got some spectacular less than successful deans out there too. But at that time, we were really looking for people with a lot of energy and enthusiasm who were willing to be entrepreneurial and just go at it. It was changing the culture that had been at Purdue, changing it relatively quickly, and driving it with incentives, carrots, basically.
Sure. Regent Paul, follow up?
So they were very future oriented.
Yes.
They picked an area that frankly wasn't necessarily a strength or even that existed, but
Not necessarily. We had 12 areas.
they knew it was important, and they had a major funder.
Yeah.
And so they went for it.
Yeah.
Were there other areas where they said, hey, we're really good at this, could be better, we should build on this?
Absolutely. Well, I'll give you one. The College of Education at Purdue is reputable, or was at the time. What they wanted to do, and this was really ahead of the curve, they wanted to focus on STEM education, and they wanted to partner with the College of Science to do it. And I said, go for it. And we even built a teaching facility, a learning facility in Discovery Park to help facilitate that. So they got out in front of the STEM wave, so to speak, in that very same way. We were able to do that. And a couple of other examples along those lines, but certainly the nanotechnology facility, the Burton Morgan Entrepreneurship or Innovation Center, basically, was an early move into every campus has those innovation centers now. And this was certainly a few years before they became that well known and that popular. So, and we largely extracted the best ideas from the people already on campus. A lot of senior distinguished professors who'd sort of had these ideas in their head and they were pent up because nobody was listening. We listened and we tried to facilitate that. Okay?
Regent Johnson.
Thank you. Dr. Mason, thank you for your service to our university and your past service. Question, and I know I'm jumping ahead because your fourth slide has to do with Purdue University and President Mitch Daniels. So you've described the period of time 01 to 07 under the present, the governor or the president you were talking about, but Mitch Daniels came along and said, we're going to change the face of Purdue University. We cannot continue to do what we're doing.
Yeah.
I'm curious about that transition, that interim, and why President Daniels came and said, we're going to change Purdue University. Can you fill in the spaces for me, please?
I can, and we're jumping right to example 4. It's on your screen, okay? Let's go to Mitch. Mitch was governor the last few years that I was provost and Martin was president. The Board of Trustees, I think they were well intended. They hired a president after Martin, the first woman ever to be president. She had been chancellor at UC Riverside, and for some reason they thought that would be comparable experience. That didn't work so well for them for a variety of reasons. But Purdue trustees are not known for being rough on their presidents. They had given her a 5-year contract. They allowed her to live out that 5-year contract. But during that time, Purdue rode the recession. I can tell you that trustees, there was a lot of turnover in trustees. Mitch was still governor for most of that time. So Mitch appointed all of the trustees for Purdue during the time that Franz Cordova was president there. I don't know well, I do know what Martin would say, but I'm not going to share that. I'll tell you what I would say. And that was partly due to the recession, but also partly because France was really in over her head and had a very difficult time trying to figure out what she could do. And I think she, coming from California, where she'd spent most of her life, she irritated the Hoosiers rather quickly by always telling them how it's done in California, which is not what you do, ever, anywhere. But she did, and as a result, they had 5 years of sort of status quo. Things stood still. So when Mitch came along, again, he had appointed all the trustees now, with the exception of the 3 alumni who'd been elected in their I believe there's still 2 that are holdovers from when Martin was president too. And they wanted another push. They wanted another energy. Let's move things forward. Mitch, as you know, having been governor, understands the politics, understands the resource issues, understood a lot about what he felt Purdue could do. His approach has been very, very top-down. The faculty have not been altogether thrilled, but Mitch has done some very, very good things for Purdue. What I did and we can abbreviate this, we can actually pass these around. This is Purdue's current strategic plan, and it's reduced to 1 page. It's called Purdue Moves the World Forward. And it's a very, very nice, let me start these going around. Oh, Sarah, you're going to come get them? Great. Thanks, Eric. You're dear. Purdue is anything but in a holding pattern. Mitch's emphases are a little different than Martin's were. Engineering has been back up in the top 5 to 10 for quite a while. Fortunately, you can sort of ride that wave of what Martin had created at Purdue for a while and be okay. So having France in there for 5 years gave the faculty that much needed breather that they had wanted from all the energy that had been on campus before that. So you can see the 5 areas, okay? Again, 5 focus areas. Affordability and accessibility, not surprising. Mitch froze tuition. It was time to do that. The tuition increases had brought Purdue back up to the middle of the pack. It's comfortable there. And it's still a very affordable and high quality engineering education. So not a problem there. Number 2 was a serendipitous addition. I got to the hotel here last night, turned on television. First thing I saw was a commercial for Purdue Global. You're probably seeing them all over the place. It's the SNHU model, the Southern New Hampshire University. You've seen those commercials everywhere. And you're going to see the Purdue Global commercials everywhere, especially in Big Ten territory. Mitch was able to acquire Kaplan University for $1. And what that did was give them a platform. They did not have to build an online platform, which is what most institutions have to do before they can start a major online effort. But what Mitch has struggled with, and he's going to continue to struggle with, is getting faculty to come along on this particular objective. It's been a tough sell. The athletic director at Purdue retired from the athletic director position, and Mitch made him, put him as a vice president in charge of the Purdue Global. He's a good businessman. He's got a great head on his shoulders. He's not an academic. So they're still struggling with how do we give this academic, as an alum of Purdue, I hear from a lot of alums of Purdue, well, I don't think we want our degree cheapened by that. And I don't think that that's going to be the result. I think, in fact, it's going to be a wonderful revenue stream for Purdue, assuming it is up and successful. And the jury's out on that. It's too new to know. But it's certainly gotten everyone's attention. STEM leadership, transformative education, and world-changing research. Okay, these are not bold, brilliant ideas. But Mitch has a way of talking about them that's very credible. He's also very careful about how he talks about them and who he talks to about them. Mitch will always do an interview with the Wall Street Journal. Always. Occasionally, he'll talk to NPR. He rarely comes to anything academic. Has he come to any Big Ten meetings? No, he still doesn't go to Big Ten meetings. He can do things that other presidents can't.
Which still leaves us at what, 13? So I think we're.
Yeah.
Regent Anderson, you had, before we move on, Dr. Mason, you had a question.
Brief question on,
Sure.
just jogged my memory here when I saw the, your sheet here. ISAs, as an investor, I've looked at ISAs and things like that, and Purdue was the first
Right.
college in the country, jog my memory, to do that.
Yeah.
Are they working at this point to reduce debt and things like that?
Hard to tell. I mean, that's another one of these things. It's going to take a decade before you can actually determine whether there are good results from that or not. I mean, the results that Mitch can talk about today are still holdovers from the 2000 through 2008 era. Growing the research enterprise, transforming education, we'd started that. STEM leadership, we certainly started that. He's continuing to expand those. They continue to show really good results. The newer things are going to take a little more time, though.
I have a question on an ISA and the process at Purdue.
Yeah.
So I'm a student, and I really don't want to have debt.
Right.
Do they have investors or investment companies lined up that students can go talk to and things like this?
Yeah, my understanding is a few, but probably not as many as they would like. I mean, again, Mitch has got great contacts, and so he's able to talk to people in a way that can get them interested in this. So it's a great place to do the experiment.
You don't have the investors lined up with stuff to get the students to go.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I mean, through their research park is growing in interesting ways. Sikorsky, for example, opened an operation in the Purdue Research Park. And that immediately gave them access to the engineering graduates, which is what they wanted. And that would be, I'm pretty sure that was their first partner in this little endeavor. And I'm sure they have others, drawing a blank, the Rolls-Royce engines. Eric, help me out. You're the engineer in the room. Anyway, at any rate, there's a couple other companies that are very much embedded. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And Dr. Mason, as we approach, we've got about a half hour left.
Okay. Well,
in our time. So what I'd like to do, if you would be amenable, and I'll turn it back to you. One is as you have questions, maybe I can kind of manage as to where you start, and then you can just engage in the dialogue, sort of as I think we have been doing. So that works well. But I know that there's a couple more examples on here that members of the board have interest in, Arizona State in particular.
Yeah, we're going to go there next.
If we can kind of try to focus, because I do want to have an opportunity for some dialogue with the Regents. Kind of focus on the interplay, if you would, between the boards at these institutions and the administration. I think that to the extent that we have you here right now, I mean, all this stuff is extremely interesting, and wish we had a lot more time, but focusing on kind of that interplay and how the board can best provide value and how, it's in the shared governance model that's really essential in this camp, or at this system, how that's worked at these other places and how we can maximize the effort as we go forward. I'll turn it over to you.
And these last two examples, and I'll go through them quickly from that perspective, okay? So Arizona State University, Michael Crow's president there. The board is along for the ride, very simply, okay? Michael is a force. The board hired him. They knew what they were getting, and they wanted that. They wanted that energy. They wanted that intellect. He is a hugely personality-driven individual, and his background is in what we call institutional design. If you want more details on how this plan came about, Larry Shin's book actually uses this as one of the examples. So really, the board was along for the ride. Michael, in his inaugural speech, coined the term a new American university. And he outlined his vision for what a new American university should look like. There is no real strategic plan at Arizona State. There are design aspirations and goals. And this is Michael, okay? This is what Michael wanted. There was very little conversation on the campus. Michael came in and looked at the landscape of Arizona State University and said, this is what I can turn it into. And he brought in Elizabeth Capaldi as his provost, and she helped him with this design. So the vision that shaped the design principles for Arizona State, and not a traditional strategic plan, were approved by the Regents in 2004. So it's a very different process. It's a very different way of thinking about strategic planning. So the design assumptions that Arizona State is using, and here's where it'll start to sound a little familiar. First of all, Michael talks about accepting their location. They're in Phoenix, Arizona, for better or for worse. And all that comes with a very fast-growing and highly diverse Sun Belt population. So not Minnesota, okay? You have Minneapolis. If you were going to do this sort of planning process, it's a very different way of thinking. It's a way of thinking about, okay, so what are we? You know, who are we? Where are we located? And how do we take maximum advantage of where we're located? Crow knew he had an underperforming K through 12 system. He knew the limits that traditional academic structures would impose on things. There would be limited financial support from the state, or for that matter, there had been limited support from other places too. And the local economy was becoming more and more knowledge-based and knowledge-driven. So he had to do something to embed what the community needed into the goals of the university. What he didn't want is for them to be like everybody else, what he would call the replication model. He wanted to build on their current strengths, which is what he calls the trajectory model. Something to think about as you go forward. And this is where board thinking can be really helpful, especially to a new president. So the vision for the design process that Arizona State used was to create, and this is a direct quote, an egalitarian institution committed to academic excellence, access, and maximum societal impact. Those were the goals. The foundational design goals, very simple. Provide access and quality for all. Achieve national standing for colleges and schools in every field. Believe me, this is what drives Michael every day. Become a national comprehensive university, research university by 2012, which by every measure he's done, and enhance local impact and embeddedness. And then from those 4 goals came 8 aspirations. So this is, you know, this is not your traditional strategic plan. This is very much design thinking. This is who we are and what we want to be as an institution. So the goals are leverage our place, transform society, value entrepreneurship, conduct youth-inspired research, enable student success, fuse intellectual disciplines, be socially embedded, and engage globally. And they're certainly doing all that. Now, in the end, they're measuring the very same things that you would measure at any institution. You know, they're looking at undergraduate enrollment, graduate enrollment, minority undergraduate enrollment, so diversity, retention, graduation rates, Pell Grants, sponsored research, all of that. Those are the metrics. There's nothing unusual about this other than you've got a grand personality who has really laid out a grand vision for what had been an urban, I guess you could have called it a research university, but it's certainly a large urban research university today. And he's built that. I mean, their undergraduate enrollment went from 43,000 to 68,000 in a 10-year period. Graduate enrollment increased from 13,000 to 16,000, and on it goes. But it ends up being measured pretty much the same way we all measure everything, and pretty much what the federal government wants to see in terms of those measurements.
Dr. Mason, I've got a couple questions for you, if you wouldn't mind.
Not at all.
And I certainly invite any of the regents, and I see Regent Anderson as well. So, and without getting too much into the kind of the micro level with respect to ASU, and you know, because in Tempe, it's got kind of a nice campus sort of feel to it. It has somewhat of a hybrid feel, but one, when you talk about the relationship between the board and President Crow, and I would ask to take it one step further to the campus and the faculty, because my sense is that the generality is probably right, but I'm guessing that the faculty was probably less present or not less absent in this conversation. I'm sure there was a part of that.
Very much so. Yeah.
One is the sort of strong top-down approach that you're describing is that something that was born out of an expectation by its board? And saying that, you know, we understand that we have needs and therefore we're going to hire a strong, as you describe it, big personality. And within that, I'm a little skeptical that, you know, very many faculty bodies around the country would find themselves, you know, disinterested.
I don't
in being
think,
more aggressive about that.
the culture at most places would sustain something like this, quite honestly, because for the very reasons that you point out, it's tough when it's this top down. I happen to know he'd been a member of the Arizona Board of Regents for a long time. I'm a graduate of the University of Arizona. So for a variety of reasons, I know a few folks out there. My understanding is that Michael basically told the board when they hired him that this is the way it's going to be. And the board was quite comfortable with that. In fact, they were quite happy that he was going to come in and really just take command of the institution and drive it forward. And he's had a lot of leeway to do that and a lot of board support. You have a question?
Yeah, and let's I appreciate that. Here's what we'll do with the last 20 minutes. I would, you know, I'd like to just maybe go and start having some of these questions. I'm pretty sure we can consume the rest of the time. Regent Anderson, then Regent Omari, then Regent Powell, and then.
Yeah.
How about that? First on the list. So what I'm taking out of this today is there's a lot of ways to get things done.
Absolutely.
Here's certain quotes I've heard you say. With Arizona State, the Regents were along for the ride. Mm-hmm. Another college, I don't know which one it was, you said was shaped by the Regents. Mm-hmm. Mitch Daniels does it on his own. Purdue, very strategic plan, laid out and done.
Yeah.
Arizona State, no strategic or long-term plan, but aspirational goals by the president.
Yep.
So what I'm finding today is what maybe was done 30 years ago, and I'm fairly new to this board.
Yeah.
Is that there's no right way to do it. I mean, I'm hearing you say
there's no formula. Yeah.
There's no one style is correct.
Yeah.
I think the board and the president is what I'm hearing you say have to get on a page where they have an idea. Is this everything going to be driven by a board, which is maybe where it was 30 years ago? Or are we going to have entrepreneurial presidents come in and say, you know, people, you're part-time board members. I've been in education my whole life, or a governor or whatever. Here's what I think can be done. I think it's a good lesson for us to find the right fit of where we are with our president. Am I correct in that assumption?
I think very much so. You know, I think you as board members need to think about what do you want to see the University of Minnesota in its total be, and think way up here. You know, don't get down in the weeds, because the minute you get down in the weeds, things will get messy and ugly. But if you have sort of the way Martin was tasked when he came into Purdue, we want engineering at Purdue to be the best. Plain and simple. You know, what do you want the University of Minnesota to be known for and as? And then begin to have those conversations with the president, so the president understands where your heads are and can start to craft what a good strategic plan might look like for the institution. And then a smart president will assemble the right kind of team to help drive it in both directions. So you've got some big top-down thinking, and you begin to bring it in from the bottom up, and you converge in the middle. And you probably will have a good and successful process at that point.
So where I sit here today, would you tell me, have aspirational goals, tell your leadership team what they are, and let them find the way to get there?
In Regent Anderson, when you talk about 30 years ago, I don't believe that was board driven. I think it really, you know, the president, and in that instance, which is interesting because Dr. Mason referred to the provost being the lead. In that situation, we had there's a building named after Vice President Dunhow, who, along with the provost at the time, worked very strongly together. And because economics were a huge part of the challenge at the point, so the financial side of it, I think, was huge. But it was a function of, my opinion of the time, was the board recognized that we needed change. We were in difficult financial times, and the faculty working with that administrative leadership really did develop what became a refinement of the institution. So it was clearly a collaborative process all across, and the board just sort of acted as a driver, say we need this kind of strategic planning, and then of course we're part of the conversation and ultimately approving what the result was. So just to be clear that at no point have I seen the board really driving it, but certainly was important in creating that as a priority.
This kind of thing allows you to really think hard about financing too. Because if these are your priorities, you need to be directing your finances to priorities. Frequently, these things drive your capital campaigns, your fundraising campaigns. Frequently, they drive, at Iowa, because I was president during both the flood and the recession, I was constantly looking to reallocate and repurpose things so that we were being as efficient as we possibly could and still making strategic investments. Not an easy thing to do under difficult circumstances. And these days, that's more what many institutions face than not, is making, setting strategic priorities in very difficult, sometimes financial situations. That requires a little different set of skills, but probably more importantly, it requires a lot of transparency to all of your constituencies, starting with your board, so that the board understands where the institution is financially, but drilling all the way down to your alumni, your friends, and campus constituents, so they understand what the constraints that you're facing are too.
Thank you. Regent Omari.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. Two questions, two or three. So Purdue, I know Indiana has an interesting higher education system, but Purdue is a single campus, correct?
It's Purdue West Lafayette is a single. It's like Minnesota. You've got campuses in Fort Wayne, Calumet, and Indianapolis too, with separate chancellors.
Okay, so separate chancellors, and then Mitch Daniels is the president of all of them?
That's correct.
And so the strategic plan that we're looking at here is for all of the campuses?
Presumably, and I don't know how Mitch has done it because I didn't ask him actually. Presumably, each of the campuses has something that looks a little like this. So this is largely West Lafayette.
So this is the Purdue that we think of when we think of Purdue.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Following that, Arizona State, is that a system?
It's very large, but I wouldn't call it a system.
I didn't think so. Okay,
Yeah.
so now this is why I'm trying to figure this out. So
Yeah.
Can you talk to us more about how to do this for a 5-system campus?
Yeah. Well, let me quickly just say a couple words about Iowa, because in Iowa you've got 3 separate institutions. Okay, you've got 2 AAU institutions, University of Iowa, Iowa State, and then University of Northern Iowa. When I got to Iowa, the board was going to do its own strategic plan. And they were going to do a very high-level strategic plan. And so because I had inherited a strategic plan that was only a year old when I got there, I said, okay, board chair, so it would be wise for me not to make any changes to the existing strategic plan until you tell me what you see is your strategic plan. Well, we had a natural disaster followed very quickly by a recession during the first year of my administration. I changed a lot of things, including setting the board's strategic planning process behind. And once we had faced those things, I couldn't wait any longer on a strategic plan because I had to put something together that would move us forward in the face of what were very dire circumstances. I had $1 billion worth of damage on campus, and I had an $80 million budget cut that happened overnight. And I was determined not to let morale tank while we were doing all of this. So we simultaneously did our strategic plans. And what I would do is as I came up with what I thought were good directions for our campus, I would run those by the board leadership. And I would say, this is what I'm thinking. Is this okay? Is this going to conflict in any way with the way your heads are thinking about the strategic plan that you want? In the end, they had half a dozen goals with metrics, all the usual kinds of things that had to do with enrollment, student success, so forth and so on. And we went from there. And every campus had its own strategic plan. Again, 3 separate universities. They don't all have, I mean, they have Iowa in their names. That's about the only common feature between the 3 institutions, but run by a single board. Similarly, Arizona, a single board for their 3 public institutions. Arizona State, not the land grant, not the flagship, not the AAU, but that's the one you hear a lot about. The University of Arizona is the land grant, the flagship, and the AAU institution, and then Northern Arizona University. So similarly to, yeah.
If I can build on your question, do those boards receive a budget from the legislature, or does each individual campus in those situations receive appropriations from the legislature?
Well, in Iowa, the legislature has refused to give up the responsibility of the allocations to the campuses, and will not allow the board to have that responsibility. I'm not sure about Arizona.
Regent Omari, do you have a follow-up?
You have do you allocate the budget to the?
Yeah, I mean, that would have a pretty significant impact on how you perceive this, because it almost becomes more of a policy plan for the board if you've got the campuses being directly funded by the legislature, whereas ours comes centrally and then the university makes the distributions. Regent Omari.
Thank you. It sounds like what I'm hearing is that the boards at these different institutions have some sort of set of goals, or as far as maybe even a strategic plan. And then the individual campuses make their strategic plan, and as long as they're not going against what the board is suggesting or wanting, then they're...
That was the case in Iowa. It's not the case in Arizona. Again, there are as many different models out there as there are models for governing boards, I'm discovering. So it often comes down to culture, not only the culture of the board, but the culture of the institution or institutions, understanding those things, and then the synchronization. I mean, you have this wonderful opportunity with a new president coming in to really all get on the same page. So how do you want to, deal with that going forward? Do you want to be directive? By the way, as we were recruiting for your next president, every candidate knew that this board has an appetite for strategic planning. Everyone was told that. So it's not going to be a surprise to anyone if you sit down with the new president and say, okay, let's talk about strategic planning. Let's talk about a process. We know there's a variety of different ways. Let's talk about culture. How do you want to orchestrate this? If I'm sitting in your seat, and by the way, I do sit on 2 governing boards. If I'm sitting in your seat, I'm thinking, so what is it I need to know to be a really good regent or trustee? What is it I want this institution to be? If I'm connected to it in some way, I might have a different idea than if I'm simply looking at it with fresh eyes as a trustee coming in from the outside. I sit on a osteopathic medical school board in Des Moines, and I sit on the Embry-Riddle board, which is heavily engineering. And there's different questions for each of those institutions that in my head I want to have answered. And so my conversations with the president tend to align with, what it is I feel I need to know to be useful to the institution as part of the governing board.
And kind of tying up the system conversation, it would seem hard for any system to have a strategic, system-wide plan that isn't informed by the individual campuses and what, sort of what things look like on the ground and what their aspirations are. And then, of course, it just becomes a collaborative process to align everything and move it forward. I'm going to turn to Regent Powell. We're in the home stretch here. Regent Powell.
Thanks, Chair. Dr. Mason. So in the Arizona conversation you were talking about, they're focused on community engagement and social impact, which sort of led me maybe not correctly, but to outreach, which is a critical part of our mission. I'm sure
You're the land grant, my goodness.
We are.
Land grants do it better than anybody.
We are, and
Yeah.
so the outreach piece is really important, I think, to this board.
Yeah.
And the university, we do a lot, and
Yeah.
and you would be very familiar with the kinds of things that
Yes.
we do, starting with agricultural extension and going
Yeah.
on. There are hundreds of programs, and I think we care deeply about that part of the mission. I guess the question is, as you think about these examples that you've given us, some of the innovation at Arizona State about social impact, are there observations that you can offer to us about new thinking on how to think about our outreach initiatives, metrics, whatever, I don't know, but it is important to us, and it's sometimes doesn't get enough of our, I think, strategic focus.
Right. Well, people in Minnesota should be, unequivocally, they should know who the University of Minnesota is. I'll give you an example that you can get more detail from your new president on. I live in the state of South Carolina now. Okay, the land-grant university in South Carolina is Clemson. But I have to tell you, the university that I see everywhere in the state, including having just built a branch campus on Hilton Head Island in my backyard, basically, is the University of South Carolina and all of its branch campuses. And it's quite remarkable that even though they're not the land grant, in many ways they're doing more of the land grant and that's what, this is that idea of the new American university. This is what Michael Crow did with Arizona State, for which I really, really applaud him and commend him. He took what was, a sleepy urban university and turned it into a national powerhouse. And in many ways, South Carolina, the University of South Carolina for South Carolina has done many of those same things and for the same reasons. And not even with that, I guess because all of my degrees are from land-grant institutions, I've always felt that the power of the land-grant institution was enormous. And watching how we were able to exploit a lot of that at Purdue in the same way. And now seeing what's happening in South Carolina, understanding that it ought to be Clemson in my backyard, not University of South Carolina. But what is South Carolina known for, especially along its coasts? Well, tourism. And who has the big hotel management program? The University of South Carolina. So that's what they built in my backyard, which makes a lot of sense given where I live and given what the community needs. So, I think more and more connecting these institutions with communities has become, and it's going to become even more important in the future, because you're trying to drive your local economies and you're trying to really help people in whatever circumstances they find themselves, realize their goals and aspirations. And their goals and aspirations inevitably are to have a better life. And as a first-generation college student, I am absolutely passionate about that. So,
Thank you. Regent Powell? All right. I'm going to move to Regent Hsu, Regent Beeson, and then back to Regent Johnson.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. So Dr. Mason, I just have two questions. One is, okay, so none of your examples actually were about land grant institutions, am I correct?
Purdue is a land
Okay, Purdue,
land grant.
but they're different from us. I'm thinking more of they're different from us. They don't have a medical school and
Right.
more heavily.
Right. Iowa has the medical school, but it's not land grant.
Right. So if you look at what we have here and all the assets that we have to deal with, how should we think about all of those things?
Yeah. You're enormous. Let's face it. So each of you probably has some idea of what, resonates with you about the University of Minnesota. I'd start there, and start that kind of process thinking. I think it's a real advantage having all of those things together. Iowa would have been smart if at one time it had built one. Okay, and it had everything in one. It's not a big enough state to sustain two AAU research universities. And as a result, one of them is always looked at as a lesser. And that's it depends on your perspective. If you're a cyclone, you think it's the other one.
Yeah.
So you have I think it's an advantage to have it all together because you can think of it in bigger terms, but it probably means that your aspirations it may be a slightly longer list of aspirations and goals as a result of that. And no strategic plan, no good one, if it focuses in too many areas, is going to get you anywhere. You really have to kind of try to figure out, okay, at this time and at this place and looking forward into the future, what do we need to push ourselves to be?
Thank you, Regent Hsu. Very quickly.
Well, just a quick follow-up to what you just said. So that's one of the issues, is that we have so much, and then if you put too much focus in one area, for example, our dean of our medical school just walked in, people get jealous, right?
Yeah, it could happen.
And same thing with engineering, you know, we just approved a
Yeah.
surcharge for them. So anyway, the last question is, two of your examples actually have a heavy online focus. And I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah. There's no doubt, now that I'm retired, I actually watch a lot more TV than I ever have. So I see who's out there advertising. And if it's not Southern New Hampshire, it's Grand Canyon or one of these other. I know the president of Southern New Hampshire very well. I know why he did it, and I know what he did, and I know how much money he's making for the institution. And he saved an institution that was about to go under. Both Arizona State and Purdue are hoping to cash in on that as another revenue stream. Just a quick note. One of the more interesting meetings I attended early on when I was president was led by John Castine, who was then president of the University of Virginia. This was before the recession, and this was before a lot of the stresses and strains put on universities. And even then, John Castine was saying to us, he says, you've got to diversify your portfolio. The more revenue streams you have, the better. The more ways in which you can garner resources for your institution, the better. If you're strictly tuition driven, if you're strictly, anything like, so you have that wonderful opportunity. You also have an opportunity, if you can do it, and I wasn't sure I could pull it off at Purdue, but we did it, was to really try to build a leadership team around cooperation. That there are things that will come. So, for example, even the liberal arts at Purdue. The liberal arts dean was coming to me with the engineering dean almost weekly with a new idea for how they could do some interdisciplinary work, which helped prevent a lot of that jealousy that you talked about. And I did some similar things at Iowa with we have two 800-pound gorillas at Iowa. We have medicine and we have liberal arts. And getting them together has never been easy. But we did some of those things that were starting to help. I don't think it's still happening, which is unfortunate. But they just hired a new liberal arts dean, and they're getting a new provost, so maybe they'll get back to it.
All right. Let's move to Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks very much, Dr. Mason. This is terrific. Organizations do take on the personality of their presidents.
They do.
Right?
Yeah.
And whether it's a top-down approach or whether it's more participatory style, that the president does influence, and we've hired a new president.
Yes, you have.
Thanks to you, your help, right?
Yeah.
And so our approach, her style, we bought her style, and her approach. So we'll be, as we re-enter the strategic planning process, we're going to be working with her on all that. My question is about the online. Looking at Purdue and ASU, there's a lot of brand value that are driven by these big personalities, but they can't afford not to make money with the online because those institutions cannot subsidize those forays for a long period of time.
Well, Crow had to build his. Martin spent Mitch spent $1.
I understand.
To get
but he
his.
spent a lot more, though, to re-engineer it, if you will.
Yeah.
And my point is that has to be a cash cow. There's other benefits to doing these big platform onlines, but at the end of the day, you got to deliver cash. And I'm not convinced yet, and maybe be proven wrong, that they'll be successful with those, but that's what they have to accomplish that.
Yes. And frequently they do, but it requires, well, you're seeing what it requires in terms of advertising.
But where else has this been, Mr. Chair? Where else has this been successful with a traditional university?
With a traditional university, yeah. You know, Purdue and Arizona State are probably the best examples. University of Maryland is an excellent example. They took full advantage of the fact that they're in that military industrial complex near Washington, D.C., and they focused initially on servicemen and women and their families. And their online University of Maryland College, I forget what it's called, but it's been highly successful, probably has enrollments comparable to Arizona State's at this time. And they, last time I looked, they had upwards close to 100,000 online students. You know, there's a lot of ways you can make online successful. You can price yourself out of the market, which probably isn't a good idea. But if you can keep it competitively priced, and that brand recognition can really, really be helpful in that regard, the question then becomes how much more appetite out there is there out there for online education. For a while, when the for-profits were suffering quite a bit because of the regulation coming out of Washington, D.C., you know, you stopped seeing University of Phoenix everywhere. You stopped seeing some of the, and a lot of the for-profits have gone out of business, or they did what Kaplan did and, you know, said, okay, I'll go a different way.
Regent Beeson, I would expect that as we go forward over these, you know, I think it's going to be.
You might want to learn a little bit more
Yeah,
about
we'll
those
have the opportunity. I know there's been some real interest in additional revenue and online and access and all these things, so we'll get into that. Closing inquiry, Regent Johnson.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mason and board members. I love this conversation. The elephant in the room for higher education that we talk about, and it's simply this: we can't sustain what we're doing. Less government help. We can't continue to increase tuition. We can't continue to have the facilities that we have. We can't continue to have all the colleges and universities. We talk about it privately. Yeah. We don't say it publicly. So as regents and administrators going forward, I'm interested in your crystal ball, how we might move forward. And, you know, we talked about different aspects, different online revenue sources, but if we don't brace up and figure out a strategic plan, and I'm not, you know, raining on the Easter parade by saying this, but we have to be honest going forward, I do not think it's sustainable.
Yeah.
Dr. Mason, a 1-minute trip inside your crystal ball.
I think you're right. I think we're seeing the sector contract and consolidate, as all business sectors do at some point in time, if you want to think of this as a business. And it's not surprising. And the real question becomes, who are the survivors going forward? I think I think big research universities are better positioned to survive than smaller institutions. And we're seeing a lot of attempts to consolidate or merge, or and I think the more creative you can get about bringing these entities together so that you can still serve the populations that need to be served, but not necessarily do it the same way you've always done it, the better off we're going to be.
Thank you, Dr. Mason. This is absolutely terrific. I appreciate your time and expertise. I hope we will be able to continue to draw on that as we go forward and as we have questions. And welcome to the welcome to the climate, as you were just describing. And I appreciate your time, Mr. Steeves.
I'll just thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll just note to close out the meeting the information item that's in your docket. It is Board of Regents policy mission statement. At this point in time, there are no changes being recommended to that policy, and so it is going back into the hopper, I guess, for future review. If at some point during the strategic planning effort there's a desire to go back and make some adjustments to that, it certainly can be brought back for an off-cycle review.
Thank you very much. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
We are adjourned.